Hello, History 131 students. This is a continuation of the lecture I uploaded last week. Hopefully, you're doing well and hanging in there. The semester is almost over. Many of you are doing extremely well on your tests. You will have two more tests and your research paper. Listen, on your research paper, choose your topic and select material that will support whatever you want to write about. It's real simple: who, what, when, how, where. Answer those questions and you'll be sufficient. Please document. Do not use Wikipedia. That's all I have to say on that. Okay, when we last left, the Roman Republic had collapsed at the Battle of Actium. The Roman Empire was stood up by Augustus. The empire would last for the next 400 years. Near the end of the empire, a emperor comes to power, and his name is Constantine. And Constantine splits the Roman Empire into half. You have an eastern part and a western part. He moved there and built a new city in Asia Minor called Constantinople. So Constantinople was the capital of the East. Rome remained the capital of the West. But for all purposes, the power of the emperor was moved to Byzantium. That's Constantinople. The power of the Pope. Remember, we was talking about Peter and the Petrine doctrine. Peter was the first Pope. The Pope now is running Rome. So, the West become more Christianized. The East become Christian, but maintain more Greek culture than Roman culture. But the West would develop into Europe. The East would develop into Byzantine or Byzantium. But what we're going to talk about today would be the foundation for medieval and modern Europe. And what we found, there were three ingredients that goes into Western civilization. That include America, Australia, and of course Europe. The basic ingredients are the cultural legacy of the Greeks and the Romans, Greco-Roman culture. The second ingredient would be the custom and tradition of the Germanic people. We're going to talk more about the Germans here. But the third and most important ingredient was Christianity. It absorbed and assimilated the other two into what we call Western civilization. Let's repeat it. German and Roman cultural legacy, Germanic tribal traditions, and Christianity. This is Western civilization. Now let's go back and talk about the Germans. They, of course, are Northern Europeans. With the move and the splitting of the Roman Empire, it left the empire weakened, particularly the western half. It would be invaded by Germanic tribes, and eventually the empire ceased to be about 476 AD. But Germanic tribes overran Europe and the rest of the Roman Empire. Now, as the empire crumbled, the church grew. The Christian church survived and grew. Now, the earliest use of the word church in the New Testament appears in St. Paul's letters to the Christian at Thessalonians. Remember what I told you earlier. It was Paul who served as the primary missionary to advance the teaching and the practice of Christianity. So, Paul of Tarsus. Now, what Paul meant by the use of the word church, he would refer to the entire Mediterranean worldwide assembly of Christians. Therefore, the word church means the community of believers. Now, the officials of the church were called the bishop of Rome, now known as Pope, from the Latin word papa, meaning father, who claims to speak and act for all Christians on earth. So, the Pope claimed to be the successor of St. Peter's on the basis of Jesus' word, the Petrine doctrine, which means upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So, the church adopted the Roman system of organization. I think you've already heard of Diocletian. He divided the empire into dioceses and established cathedrals, which was the heart of the power of the bishop. Now, let's look at the church in the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine legalized the practice of Christianity in 312 AD. Constantine is very important in the triumph and the spread of Christianity. We're going to talk more about him later. He was converted to Christianity on his ride into Rome, crossing the Rubicon. He saw the image of a cross and he became a Christian. But Constantine, the emperor, did a lot to get this religion off on its footing. We'll talk more about him. Emperor Theodosius, though, made Christianity the official religion of the empire. So let's repeat this. It's going to be on your next test. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Constantine legalized the practice of Christianity. Theodosius allowed the church to establish its own court and body of law called canon law. At the time of his death, the church was independent of the authority of the Roman state, and the foundation and power of the medieval church had been laid. But of course, just as today, theological disputes arise. In the 4th century, that's 300 AD, frequent and sharply divided disputes divided the Christian community. One disagreement had to do with the nature of Christ. Who was Christ? Arius, the priest of Alexander, denied that Christ was divine and the same as God, and that he had always existed with God the Father, which was two tenets of the early Christian belief. Arius reasoned that since Christ was created and he could not have been co-eternal with God. Christian branded his teaching Arianism and declared him a heretic, or the denial of doctrine of faith. Constantine, to resolve this issue over church-state relations, to resolve this issue over the nature of Christ, called a council of church leaders to Nicosia, Asia Minor, to settle the dispute. The council produced the Nicene Creed. Ever heard of that? Which defined their position that Christ was eternally begotten by the Father and of the same substance as the Father, conclusion, they were one. So they developed what we call the Holy Trinity: God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. They're one. So when we, as Christians today, when you pray to God or you pray to Jesus. They are considered to be one of the same. The Council of Nicosia. Also at this council, Constantine and the church elders decided what would make up the New Testament, the book of the Christians. They tossed out books, but they included, I think, 26 books were included in the New Testament. This is where this religion is coming together. He also published and wrote sermons to be used to teach in the churches throughout Europe. But he also declared Sunday as an official holiday, a day to worship Christ. Now, keep in mind, the other two Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, both celebrate their Sabbath day from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. But now Christians are starting a new Sabbath day, Sunday, and it all comes from this Council of Nicosia led by Emperor Constantine. So, this will be on your test. Don't forget, look up the Nicene Creed, the Apostle Creed, or the Council of Nicosia. Google it and see what you find out about that. Now, these disputes continued even with Constantine and Theodosius. When it came to church-state relationship, Emperor Theodosius ordered Bishop Ambrose of Milan to hand over his cathedral to the emperor. Ambrose refused. Ambrose insisted that the church was independent of the state or the emperor's jurisdiction. In matters relating to the faith of churches, the bishop was the judge of the emperor, not the other way around. So we see church-state being established, the nature of Christ's dispute being resolved, and the establishment of the Pope and his power in Rome. So the headquarters of the church become more powerful and would lead the West. It was Pope Leo I which enhanced the prestige of Rome and the church when he went out and met the advancing army of Attila the Hun and saved Rome from destruction. These early popes would handle the problems of pressing the city, floods, famine, plagues, and invasions by the Germanic tribes. It was the Christian leaders who filled the void of leadership rather than the imperial administrators. And of course, now spreading this religion, missionary activity. And of course, we already talked about Paul, who started the missionary policy of the early church. The first church evolved into what we call Catholic. They sought to make their faith universal, or general, or worldwide. And they followed the example set by Paul, who urged Christians to bring the good news of Christ to all people. This is the missionary policy of the Christian church. Missionaries ventured out all across Europe. Christianity beginning in Gaul was due to St. Martin of Tours. And of course, St. Patrick Christianized the Irish on the island of Ireland. St. Patrick's Day in March, we celebrate his holiday. St. Columba in Scotland. But the most influential of these early missionaries would be also Augustine of Hippo. He began the Christianization of the English when he succeeded in converting the King Ethelbert into Christianity, which was followed by a mass baptism. Now notice these missionaries, when they would go out, they would concentrate their effort on the king, the queen, the royal family. And once they accepted Christianity, mass baptism would follow. But there's a problem. Just because one has been baptized and converted to Christianity, that doesn't mean they have been assimilated. And this was the most difficult part of converting pagans. So missionaries pursued a policy of assimilating by stressing similarity of customs and belief between pagans and Christians. That's what the non-believers are called, pagans. An example would be adopting the old pagan festival of Lupercalia, St. Valentine's Day, Christmas, winter solstice, Easter, spring solstice. Now, as you know, many of Christmas coming up. What does Santa Claus have to do with the birth of Christ? What does putting up a Christmas tree, a pine, a tree have to do with the birth of Christ? It doesn't. These are all pagan festivals that continues even today. But the early missionary, in order to convert the pagans to their relief, agreed to adopt the winter solstice as a Christian holiday and celebrate it as the birth of Christ. They did the same for Easter, where they used the spring solstice to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. So, early Christians were adopting this faith, but they harbored a strong hatred of the pagan, Roman, and Greek culture. Good Christians sought to the kingdom of heaven, believed they had to disassociate themselves from the filth of the Roman culture. Since they believed that the end of the world was near, they considered knowledge useless and learning a waste of time. However, Christians had little choice but to adopt to the Greco-Roman culture because it was the only culture they knew. The result was a compromise. Saint Jerome, the theologian and linguist, translated the Old and New Testament from Hebrew, Greek, into vernacular Latin. Let's talk about that. Now, our language is English. The Romance language, English, French, Spanish, Italian, all come from Latin. Latin is at the root of all of the Romance language. Our language, the European language, is based on Latin. So this translation of the New and Old Testament by Saint Jerome now made it possible for the Europeans to read and understand the Holy Bible. This publication was called the Vulgate. St. Augustine of Hippo was one of the most brilliant thinkers in history of the Western world. He blended classical and Christian ideas into a belief. Example of his work would be his autobiography entitled The Confession. He also published other things. He contributed on the nature of the church that arose around the Donatist Heritage movement. Augustine also published a book called The City of God, which presents a moral interpretation of the Roman government in all history. According to Augustine, history of the account of God acting in time, Augustine used Roman history as evidence to defend Christian theology. He assimilated Roman history into Christian teaching. But some was not pleased with what was going on. Some took up a life of being a hermit, moved into the desert. One man climbed a tree and stayed up there until he starved to death. Hermetism. So in order to do something about that, the church established monastery. We call it monasticism, where devout believers could go and practice their faith and also write and work to spread their faith. Later, nunneries were established so women could go and also practice their belief. Now, what else do I want to tell you about this? Well, let's mention the migration of the Germanic tribes. We call it the vocal wandering. Uh, the Germans was just like most of the world, Africans, Asians. They practiced. Uh, what did they practice? They were not Christians. They were not monotheistic. They were animists. They had no concept of state, but everything was centered around the group or the tribe or the folk. The primary stimulus for that gradual migration was the Roman frontier, which offered service in the army and work around the pavement. Some of the Germanic tribes are the Lombards, the Frankish, the Visigoths, the Vandals, Moravians. But this is the Germanic society, and they replaced the Romans as rulers on the European continent, and the new European society emerged. The German had no notion of state. They thought of social, not political terms. They worked off customs and traditions, uh, and but the molding of the Roman law and Germanic custom resulted into feudalism. And this is the beginning of feudalism that we will talk about later. In closing, now remember what I told you about the splitting of the Roman Empire. Rome continued to survive as the headquarters of the Catholic Church with the Pope, now Vatican City. But in Byzantine East, Emperor Constantine had tried to maintain the Roman Empire, but during the 5th and 6th century, the western eastern half drifted apart. The Latin Church was bequeathed to the Western world, Catholicism. The Byzantine cultural center at Constantinople was dominant in the East. They split also, became the Greek Orthodox Church. The churches differ considerably in the East and the West. The church in the West grew away from the empire and became involved in social and political affairs of the West. In the East, the emperor looked upon religion as a branch of the state. So, Byzantine. And what else do I want to tell you about that? Oh, in the East, also similar to the West, they were threatened by invaders. Tribes such as the Avars, the Slavs, the Persian, and the Arab threatened the Byzantine Empire. And eventually, around 1200 AD, they would be conquered by the Muslims. But in the middle of the Byzantine Empire, an important thing, a book occurred, the publishing of the Justinian Code, which was a major contribution to the body of law. Published in 529 by Emperor Justinian, it became the backbone of Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, which is the foundation for law for nearly every modern European and Western nation, including the U.S. Now, just think, if you go to court, you go to either criminal court or civil court. Our civil laws derive from the Justinian Code. So remember, get a divorce, that's civil court. You sue someone, that's civil court. If you kill someone, that's criminal court. There's a different, there are two sets of laws, civil law and criminal law. So the Byzantines highly prized education. Their literature was mostly Greek. History was their favorite subject. The Byzantine passed Greco-Roman teaching of mathematics on to the Arabs, who assimilated it and made remarkable advances with it and gave us Arabic numbers, our 1, 2, 3, 4. The best known Byzantine scientific discovery was Greek fire. In private life, the Byzantine in the 10th century remained the greatest city in the Christian world. In commerce, Jewish, Muslim, and Italian merchants controlled most of the foreign trade. In the homes of the upper class, We see the segregation of women seem to be the first principle of the interior design. The reason for the segregation was family honor. Later, the Muslim would adopt the same practice of a harem, probably derived from the Greek practice. Also, they gave us locks on doors for the first time, and a strange pattern of delivery of babies where a woman is in a crotch position instead of laying on her back. So, Europe is coming together. Christianity has triumphed. It is now the dominant religion on the European continent. Be blessed, and I'll check with you again next week. I'm thinking about establishing your next test 3 for November the 11th, Veterans Day. Be blessed and have a good weekend.